You amazing hackers. If you've ever attended a live lesson from me, chances are high that you've heard me say this in the past. I hate automation, but why do I always say this when you hear so often that you should automate things that are repetitive? It's because I don't disagree with the fact that you have to automate your repetition, but that is where most go wrong. They don't want to take the time to organize their own thoughts and actually do the work before they want to automate it. Rather, the wrong direction that's sometimes taken is one where hackers desire to implement an automation of someone else's work into their flow, thinking they can implement a practical solution of a theoretical idea without the actual experience. Join me as I tell you what I think is a healthy relationship with automation and what it looks like. Foundation. So, as my dad owns his own construction company, I like to make the comparison between building houses and my own craft. If you build a house and have a bad foundation, it will collapse, and so will you if you don't build yourself and your automation workflow up on a solid foundation. The foundation for me starts with what automation, and that entails quite a lot. Automation is the act of programming a workflow that is repeatable or has a structure to it. This is important because that repetition is something I want to zoom in on. You can't automate things if you don't know how to do them manually, and that repeatability and structure has great importance. Let's focus on repetition first and imagine that we have a flow we can always automate the exact same way. A port scan followed by a vulnerability scan with Nikto for all the web application ports. This seems like a very simple task, but what seems simple at first becomes complex with just a few caveats. What ports contain a web server? Do you only do port 443 and port 80? How do you know otherwise what you would scan? Will you look at the banners? What about ports that are more hidden and need a different type or more thorough port scan? A simple task turns complex fast, and you can rest assured that complexity is the enemy of repeatability. Now, let's move on to structures because this is one of our saving graces if we want to automate as much as possible. First of all, you need to start thinking in structures which capture the greatest amount of scenarios, but never all. That complex sentence just means that you need to stop worrying about all of those outliers so much and focus on the main body of scenarios. The outliers need to be accounted for in the form of error handling, but it should not become a hacker's main focus. If we take all of those tips together, we have to identify flows we repeat, divide their scenarios into structures that cover the most valuable parts first, and make sure that we build error handling for the unexpected. In the case of our scenario where we want a port scan and to do a vulnerability scan on a web server, we can try to perform this exercise. As our example of a port scan followed by a web app vulnerability scan, we can identify the following key repetitions. Number one is perform a port scan on the standard ports. Number two is perform a bigger port scan, making sure to find obscure web servers. Then we provide a full TCP UDP port scan to enumerate very obscure servers, and we perform a vulnerability scan with Nikto followed by a vulnerability scan with Nuclei. Given this, we can identify the following structures being a forming of a port scan on the standard ports as a fast scan followed by Nikto Nuclei scan in parallel with multi-threading, and we can perform a bigger scan with banner enumeration to ensure that we find more obscure web servers also found followed by Nikto and Nuclei in parallel. Then we can also identify the flow of a full port scan with, of course, Nikto and Nuclei again in parallel. With these possible exceptions, being that the web server not being online or the web server gives a timeout, I'm sure that you can think of more exceptions that might happen. If not, just try running the script and you'll see that you'll encounter them anyway very soon. So, for the full picture, to conclude, now that you have a positive idea of where to start and how to handle each leg of the journey, I want you to make sure that you start with defining an MVP. An MVP, or minimum viable product, is a piece of automation which is sufficient to take into what's known as a production environment when you work on improvements. I want you to set up a test VPS and a live VPS because you should always be running your automation while you work on improving it. And that can only be done if you have your live system running while you have your test server to test on. So while you take all of that in mind, don't fall in the trap of error handling. Just catch all exceptions and throw them into an error log and then see what you can do about it later. And without actually using your hard work for what it's intended, it will never be fruitful. So go out there and actually start scanning, my friends. Thank you very much for watching. Really appreciate it. And I'll see you in the next